Please be seated. The court is now in session. The floor will be once again given to the prosecution to continue putting questions to the expert. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning, Your Honours. Good morning, Counsel, and good morning to you, Mr. Philip Short. As you will have heard from the President's instructions yesterday, these are the final stages of my examination. And after approximately an hour and a half, I'll be handing the floor to my colleagues, representatives of the civil parties. Now, picking up where we left off yesterday, we were looking at a minute of a meeting of the Standing Committee, which for the record was E3/232, and we looked at the reports given by three sector secretaries in relation to events in their regions, and you opined about the nature of those reports and other reports that you've looked at. Just taking one step back and looking at the attendance record, and again here you said to us yesterday that your view secretary was Pol Pot, deputy secretary was Nguyen Chia, Comrade Ham was Khieu Samphan. Can I ask you whether you have been able to come to a view as to why Khieu Samphan's attendance was required or appropriate at a meeting of this nature?
Khieu Samphan was not a member of the Standing Committee, and I think it's important to emphasize that. But he did attend most, if not all, probably not all, but certainly the great majority of Standing Committee meetings. And his name is on the minutes. And that is because he was in a special position. He was at the center of power, though he did not belong to that center. And it was an unusual position, but one which Pol Pot had wished. And one may speculate, and I think I've said this already, that Pol Pot saw Khieu Samphan as someone who might eventually take over more and more leadership duties. That is speculation. But in the event, it never happened, and it never happened because, for various reasons, but one of which was that Khieu Samphan was not a leader. He was someone who was extremely useful for the leading circle, but did not, in Pol Pot's judgment, have the qualities to become the leader or a senior leader.
Thank you. Let me ask you a little bit about reports and telegrams before we come back to these issues. We sent you a series of reports, and that was a representative sample. It was 15 documents, and obviously in the time we have, we won't be able to go through them. If I can ask you first whether you've had a chance to familiarise yourself with them.
Yes, I have read through all the documents you sent.
Thank you. Just again, by way of eliciting your expert opinion on this without necessarily looking at each of the reports, are they consistent with other materials you've looked at? This is a sample. You opined yesterday that you informed us that you looked at a number of reports and telegrams. Is this consistent with the general manner of reporting in terms of content and information being provided?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to now return to the issue of the evolution of purges that you describe in your book, The Events of 1976 and 1977. And here, again, we must go relatively quickly, so I won't have the time to read all of the relevant pages from the book. But another significant event which you deal with is an explosion which took place outside the Royal Palace, and then a series of events which followed, beginning with the arrest of a number of soldiers, leading to the arrest of Chan Chakri, and then ultimately, or rather following him, Chuk. Can I ask you to describe for us what significance you place on those events?
Well, to be very brief, it was another stage in the evolution of what one can only call the paranoid mindset of the CPK leadership. An event would happen which would trigger suspicions which would go in many different directions, in this case towards the eastern zone, towards Chan Chakre and Chuk, and that would lead to the arrests not only of those people but of all those connected with them in ever-widening circles. And that was the pattern which happened in all the zones thereafter.
Thank you. Now, just looking briefly at the matter of Chakri, and I will not deal with individual arrests except for only one or two by way of illustration of the evolution of the policy and its significance. I want to take you to an extract from Khieu Samphan's book. This is the 2007 book that we sent you a copy of, or rather, we sent you a copy of Chapter 5, which we have available in 3 languages. If you could go to page 53 of that translation, and I'll give the ERNs and the E number. Mr. President, this is E3/16, and the relevant ERNs are Khmer 003804444, French 006438777 and following, and English 00498272. And on this page, Khieu Samphan is discussing the arrest of Chan Chakri and circumstances surrounding that event. And he says the following, quote, "As for Chakri, Pol Pot had not trusted him for quite some time. For example, at the 9 October 1975 meeting of the Standing Committee, he remarked that even though his, that is Khoi Tuan's, division was strong, the political education of the combatants was not very profound, and Chakri himself was new and had his position because of Vietnam. We must monitor somewhat closely. It is my understanding that Pol Pot's saying this in front of the Standing Committee was responsible speech, not words of hatred for Chakri because of some matter. He was speaking as a party secretary who had been monitoring Chakri for a very long time." I'm interested particularly in the use of the words that in Khieu Samphan's understanding, this was responsible speech, something that followed monitoring for a long time. Are you able to opine on that issue of the way Chakri was treated?
The question, and I am answering your question, but the question which that phrase arises in my mind is, why did Khieu Samphan write it? Is it because Khieu Samphan believed that it was responsible speech? In other words, that he believed that there really was a plot by Chanchakre and others? Or is it the view justifying the purges that he wished to convey? Because when I talked about these things with Ieng Sary, he basically said that Pol Pot was, he didn't use the word paranoid, but excessively suspicious, and that most of these so-called plots were figments of his imagination. And I would have thought that somebody in Khieu Samphan's position would have drawn similar conclusions. So to see him writing that, in effect, there was a justifiable basis for this kind of purge raises questions as to why he would say that, why he would think it. I don't have an answer.
I might be asking an obvious question, but would you agree or disagree that it was responsible speech, this monitoring and suspicion vis-à-vis Chakri, if you're able to come to a view?
That Pol Pot was suspicious of Chakre, I think there's no doubt. Whether there was any basis for that suspicion is a totally different issue. And one would have thought that somebody like Khieu Samphan, as Ieng Sary, would have formed his own judgment as to whether there was a basis for it. But what Mr. Khieu Samphan has written, yes, does make sense, because the whole of the eastern zone, the leadership came under suspicion because of their very close links with Vietnam, just across the border, and the influence of the former Khmer Viet Minh. So yes, it was responsible speech in the sense that Pol Pot was genuinely suspicious of them. Was there a basis, a real basis for that suspicion? That's a completely different question.
I'll move on to another topic. We may revisit these types of issues. As we go forward in time, your book also deals with the question of what I believe you describe as a deteriorating relationship with Vietnam, border negotiations in relation to the borders in 1976 and standing committees' deliberations on the issue. And there's a passage here which I think may be relevant to this issue of a view of the Vietnamese as engaging in a conspiracy. This is at page 356 to 357 of the book, and the ERNs are in English 00396-564 and in French 00639-922. And I'm really looking at the bottom of that first page, where you describe that a summit that had been planned between the two countries was postponed. And then you say the following: in public, the Cambodians redoubled their protestations of friendship. In private, confidence nosedived. Even before the meetings, the Standing Committee had been worrying about the possibility of an assassination attempt if the summit were to take place. A preposterous idea, but one which reflected the paranoia that had gripped the Cambodian leadership. Can I ask you to expand on your conclusion that this was, as you describe it, a preposterous idea?
I may be mistaken, but I cannot think of any instance where a country has invited a head of state of a neighboring country or another country to come to a summit meeting and has arranged the assassination of that leader. I don't think it's ever happened, and for very obvious reasons. The opprobrium that would fall on the host state would be such that there would be much better ways of trying to deal with that kind of problem.
Now, just by way of context, you also described the incursions in 1977 into Vietnamese territory by Cambodian troops. We won't deal with that, but I just want to contextualize where we're going. And this chapter then deals also with the way in which the regime enforced its policy with respect to enemies, and in particular, how it did that through S21. We won't spend much time on S21, but I wish to read a couple of passages where you describe what you, I think, you see as the mission or importance of this facility, or the centre. So going to page 364 of the book to 365. The ERNs are French 0063992 and following, and English 00396-572 and following. You're dealing with the 1976/1977 period, by way of context. And you say, nothing illustrated better the ghastliness of Pol's regime than S21 and its associated institutions in the provinces. Not because of what they were, all totalitarian regimes torture and kill their opponents, but because they represented, in its purest form, a doctrine of extermination. Over the page, in the upper half of the page, having looked at atrocities in other countries and tragic events happening in other countries where atrocities have taken place, you say the following: yet S21 was different in ways that set it apart from all other institutions of its kind. In Stalinist Russia, in Nazi Germany, in countries like Argentina, Indonesia and Iraq, the death camps were monstrous aberrations growing from the dark side of societies, which in other respects appeared more or less normal, and where those outside the concentration camp universe enjoyed certain basic freedoms. Tuol Sleng was not an aberration. Instead, it was the pinnacle, the distillation, the reflection in concentrated form of the slave state which Pol had created. And if I can start with that last part, can you tell the court why you came to the view that S21 was the pinnacle and the reflection in concentrated form of the slave state?
Because in the dystopian vision that the Communist Party of Kampuchea had, freedoms were equated with individuality and were suppressed throughout the country. And the place where freedoms were most completely suppressed, including eventually the freedom to live, was Tuol Sleng. In that sense, it was the apex of that pyramid. However, it was by no means unique. there is a very close parallel with the French prisons in Algeria, and that is not a matter for this tribunal, I recognize, but it is perhaps worth saying that France is among the countries financing this tribunal, supporting it. In France, not one person has been brought to trial for exactly the same kinds of offences as were committed at Tuol Sleng.
If we can come back to your view about S21, you do say that what sets apart Tuol Sleng from other similar operations in other countries is that it was not an aberration, but rather a pinnacle of a state. But you also say in the first part that I read that it, together with associated institutions in the provinces, illustrated the ghastliness of the regime. Can I ask you to expand on this view or rather on the use of the term associated institutions? What did you mean by that?
I was referring essentially to the district prisons, and in each Cambodian district there was a prison under the responsibility of the district chief, and offenders, those whose loyalty, reliability was judged to be doubtful, were sent from the collectives, if their case was serious enough, to the district prison, and again, if serious enough, they would go up to S21. In most cases, those sent to S21 were people who had some responsibility under the regime. Ordinary peasants who were regarded as expendable or should be killed were killed in situ. Those who needed to be interrogated were brought to S21.
Thank you. Now, looking at the phenomenon of the use of confessions and the development of theories as part of this policy on the part of the regime, there are several very useful and interesting passages in the book, and you've already hinted at one of them. And I might just read it for context so that everybody has the specific paragraphs in mind. This is at pages 359 and 360. French English ERNs are 003965667 and following, and French 006399927 and following. What you describe there is the arrests in the second half of 1976 of Naysaran and Khmer. And you say that they were accused of conspiring to create a new Vietnamese-backed Kampuchean Workers' Party. And you say that in your view, no such party ever existed, and Pol Pot very well knew this. Over the page, I'll read this passage. Quote, "In the end, the regime claimed to have documentary proof, meaning confessions extracted under torture, of no fewer than 6 bungled attempts on Pol's life. Many years later, Ieng Sary admitted that none of it had been true. There were no coup attempts, he said. It was all greatly exaggerated. In Pol's mind, there were serious incidents, but in fact, they were a pretext for a crackdown." A little bit further down, you say, in simple language, moderates were traitors. So just to encapsulate that, is it your view that this documentary proof, as you call it in inverted commas, was considered significant by the regime Was it useful, or what's the appropriate way to describe it?
It was justification after the event. Ankar, the CPK, was always right. It could not be mistaken. Therefore, to prove it was correct, confessions had to be extorted, which would prove not only, I would take that back, which would prove to high-level cadres, to whom in some cases these confessions were read out at study sessions, that Ankar had been correct. There is a real question whether and to what extent and in what way the top leadership, and indeed people like Duc, believed or had placed any credence in the confessions being extorted. That I cannot really offer an opinion on.
And just a couple more references before we leave the issue of confessions and their significance. You say at page 358 of the book, where you opine that the confessions were of little intrinsic value themselves, and that Pol Pot was not so foolish to put faith in statements extracted under torture. In the book that we've been looking at, a book published by Khieu Samphan, there is reference to these passages of your book, and I'd like to look at them briefly. So again, this is document E3/16, and there are two relevant paragraphs that I'd like to read. The first is at Khmer ERN 00380445, French 0064387829, and English 00498 where he says the following. I think there might be a misspelling here insofar as it refers to David Short. I think a reference might be to Philip Short. I want to see if I can give you the exact page number. Have you been able to find that particular page? Okay, it's 54 in the English translation. So there, in the upper half, I am inclined to agree with David Short that Pol Pot was not so stupid as to believe documents that came from the use of torture. But Philip Short seems to have overspoken somewhat in saying that the role of prison S21 and the confessions it supplied was not to provide information, but was rather to provide the proof of treason that the leadership needed to arrest those they had already decided to arrest. According to what I understood, Pol Pot's methodology on any issue was to gather maximum documentation for analysis before making a decision. He had even compiled a document entitled Leading and Working Following the 378 Principle of Analysis for training combatants and cadre at every echelon. Let me stop there for a moment. Would you care to opine on that description of or characterization of your treatment of the use of confessions?
I wouldn't dispute what Khieu Samphan has written. I took the view that the essential purpose was to justify that Pol Pot may also have been interested in the content and may have drawn bits of information from the content. That is entirely possible. But I would say that two things. First of all, in the Cambodian Foreign Ministry, it was a rule of thumb that unless you were mentioned 3 times in confessions, they didn't bother to arrest you. And after a while, there were so many interrogations and confessions, it became a rule of thumb that you had to be denounced 5 times before you were under suspicion. Pol himself, speaking about Mern, Pik Chang's wife, said, even if she's denounced 8 times, it's not possible that she's guilty, which shows at least a certain cynicism about the nature of confessions.
In your interviews with Khieu Samphan, were you able to discuss with him any of these topics? For example, his knowledge of the use of the methodologies that, according to him, Pol Pot used in investigating cadre?
The only point in what he's written here, which I can confirm we discussed and which ties in with this, is Pol Pot's obtaining maximum information before he announced his decision. That was apparently his method. Yeah.
And turning to the second paragraph that I wanted to read, this is at Khmer ERN 0038045 to 55, French 0064388 to 3, and 00498 to 8 for English. And here again, under number 3, I'm going to try and give you a specific page in English. At 58, bottom of 58 of the English translation. Quote, "Because of the clear interference of the Vietnamese that I have repeatedly described above, I wish to take this opportunity to make an observation. The evidence Philip Short provided about the Vietnamese having created the Khmer Rum Do movement, together with the evidence that other researchers have discovered, makes it clear that all of Pol Pot's monitoring, following his 378 principle of Chakri, Chuk, Ya and the other cadre who had cooperated with the Viet Minh, was correct. Thus, Philip Short was incorrect when he wrote, the role of prison S21 and the confessions was not primarily to provide information, but rather to provide the proof of treason that they needed to arrest anyone they had already decided to arrest. The policy of independence from Vietnam required the implementation of absolute policies inside the country." Now, we looked yesterday briefly at the issue of Khmer Rum Do, and you gave us your opinion about the extent to which that could be taken as evidence of Vietnamese interference. Looking at the commentary here by Khieu Samphan, do you agree or disagree with his conclusions that the evidence you've unearthed essentially has provided justification for Pol Pot's monitoring and arrests of these people?
This is the classic Khmer Rouge CPK explanation, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are convinced that the Vietnamese wish you ill, then you see all kinds of reasons to take measures against the Vietnamese, which in turn the Vietnamese are aware of, and it becomes enmity. Now, I'm not surprised that Mr. Khieu Samphan should write as he did, but I would again return to this word paranoia. A paranoia for which there were perfectly understandable historical reasons. If you look back at what happened to Cambodia over the last 2 centuries, it's understandable. But it triggered, it created or enlarged a problem which could have been dealt with differently.
So do I understand you correctly that there was some basis for apprehensiveness about the Vietnamese, but that perhaps the conspiracy theory, as far as it was taken, was not justified, or if you can just elaborate on that a little bit further without me putting words in your mouth.
I think the term "some basis for apprehensiveness" is absolutely correct. Historically, there was, and indeed in Vietnamese, then contemporary Vietnamese statements, there was a basis for apprehensiveness. The Vietnamese did want Cambodia to be, in a sense, subordinate, to be part of a larger entity in which Vietnam would be dominant. That was a reality. The problem was that in the way that the CPK reacted to that, instead of trying to resolve the problem, it made it worse by what I would again say was paranoia.
And it is that paranoia, if I understand it correctly, which fueled the murder that we see on a mass scale.
It was that paranoia which fueled the purges, and separately, I would not say mass murder, but it was the same paranoia that was responsible for the determination to push the country to its limits, to build itself up in order to be able to resist Vietnam, causing death from overwork, starvation, exhaustion, and so on.
In your book, you also describe a paranoia of fear that was created as a result of the evolving purges and arrests. And I won't be spending a lot of time on this. There's only a couple of passages that are of interest. At page 366, French ERN 0063995 and English 0039657 you say the following: confessions of treason were needed for men like Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan to read out at closed party meetings, proving that Angkar had as many eyes as a pineapple and that nothing could escape its vigilance. The climate of fear this generated helped to unmask new traitors who were then tortured to make them identify other members of their strings, the Ksai, or patronage networks, which were the basis of political activity in Cambodia. Can I ask you first, in the research that you've conducted, interviews, information you've gathered, how prevalent was this practice of people like Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan reading out confessions in closed party meetings to prove conspiracies against Angkar?
I know of two cases, which is why I said Khieu Samphan and Ieng Sary. Whether it was much more general, I really don't know. It happened.
Can I ask you to comment further on this climate of fear? Because I think you comment in other parts of the book on this being also a phenomenon in other parts of the country. Am I right in understanding that this was a general feeling, if you like, or prevailing situation in the country as a result of the purges?
Fear was a very important instrument of power, of rule for the CPK. And one reason why it was necessary is that they were very few on the ground. The Cambodian Communist Party's membership was never more than about 14,000. Well, in a country of several million, however many million it was at that time, that is a very tiny group. So fear was used to instill discipline. Fear was used to control the population. But above all, it was used to keep the party, to keep the faithful in line.
On the issue of decisions that are made in relation to arrests and the awareness on the part of leadership in Phnom Penh of such practices, both in the capital and around the country, you say the following at page 371, French ERN 00639 941-2 and English 00396-579. You first describe some of the brutalities that took place in prisons in the regions, and you do indicate that some of them were similar to practices even before the Khmer Rouge time. And then you say the following: the leadership in Phnom Penh knew of such practices. They were mentioned in telegrams to Son Sen from officials in the provinces. There is no reason to think that Pol and other standing committee members approved, but nor did they do anything to stop them. The seething class hatred of the peasants, however hideous the forms it might take, had to be assumed and embraced. Would it be fair to augment that passage with the specific reports that we've looked at, or at least the ones that I've sent you, where there is actual reference to arrests of enemies, insofar as one discusses the issue of knowledge of leadership, so that you make reference here to telegrams to Son Sen from officials, and I just want to see if it's fair to augment that conclusion with evidence from these other reports and other sources of information flowing upwards towards the party centre.
I think we're talking about two different things. The reports from officials to Son Sen were about superstitious practices of mutilation, which akin to witchcraft, which are very traditional, which are practiced by the Isaraks and by Khmer Rouge cadres in the countryside. Those the leadership would have disapproved of. The arrest of enemies, no, that was absolutely policy. So they would have had no problem with that at all.
Thank you for clarifying that. It's useful. It's a useful clarification. Now, staying on this page, a little bit further down, you say the following: S21 was viewed in the same way. Neither Pol himself nor Nun Chia ever went there, but to each it was an essential instrument of the revolutionary state. Pol himself decided on the most important arrests, sometimes in consultation with Khieu Samphan. We've been looking at, or you've given evidence about your conclusions in relation to this relationship. Can I ask you whether this is relevant, whether that relationship, if you have been able to come to a conclusion, whether that relationship of increasing trust was a reason that Khieu Samphan, as you say, was consulted in relation to the most important arrests? Or is there a different explanation?
The basis for that statement in my book, and consultation can have different meanings, so I'd like to specify what was meant there, was I was told, and by a source I regarded as reliable, reliable enough to put it in a book, whether reliable enough for a court of law is not necessarily the same thing, that during a certain period, Pol Pot used Khieu Samphan for missions into the provinces, and that Khieu Samphan was sent to evaluate a situation in the provinces and would report back. And on the basis of that report, or partly on the basis of that report, no doubt with other sources, Pol Pot would then decide whether or not to arrest certain people in the provinces. So consultation did not mean he asked Khieu Samphan, do you think we should arrest this man? It was much more a mission of information. That is my understanding, anyway.
But as you understand it, the mission of information relating to a potential arrest of someone who's under suspicion, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, and that is very much in Khieu Samphan's role. He was trusted. He was someone in whom Pol Pot had confidence to follow the line that Pol Pot laid down, to do what he asked.
Just before we leave the issue of purges, and we will leave it very shortly, I want to touch upon just one more phenomenon. You've already hinted at it, and it is the issue of regional purges. And you describe Tamok's forces being sent into a number of different parts of the country, and then you describe arrests that follow, ultimately culminating in the East Zone. In a purge of the East Zone. Can I ask you to sum up for us briefly your findings in relation to the procedure, the mechanism by which this occurred, whereby, if I understand the book correctly, decisions made at the centre would then be implemented by these regional forces?
One of Pol Pot's problems was that he never really managed to unite the armed forces. They remained under different warlords. And the most important of the warlords were Khai Pok, Sopim in the east, and Tamok. And as time passed, Pol came to rely more and more on Tamok. So in the last years, the last period of the Khmer Rouge regime, when a provincial leadership fell under suspicion, which meant, because of the patronage networks, that very large numbers of cadres in that region would be under suspicion, it was Tamok's troops who were sent in to first of all arrest them. Khai Pok did the same thing in certain regions, to arrest them and then to replace them with cadres from their own areas, which they regarded as loyal.
Thank you. Now, just to look at a couple of speeches which seem to relate to the issue we're discussing, broadly speaking, and enemies and their treatment. In the bundle of documents we sent you is a 1977 speech given by Khieu Samphan. It's an anniversary speech given on the 15th of April 1977. The document number here is E3/201. Mr. President, with your permission, I have a copy which I can pass to the expert with the relevant extracts for his examination.
The President, you may proceed. Court officer, please bring the document from the prosecutor to the expert.
Thank you, Mr. President. So this is a transcript of that speech, in this case by entitled Summary of World Broadcasts, which I understand is a BBC publication, which you're probably more familiar with than we are. It's a long speech, so I'll just read one or two passages. And this is on the first and second page of your hard copy, Mr. Short. The relevant ERNs are Khmer 00292 803 to 805, French 00612 165 to 6, and English 00419 512 to 3. And I'll start on that second page and see if that might suffice for our purposes in the interest of time. The second paragraph from the top, quote, "Immediately after liberation, when we suffered untold difficulties as we had just emerged from the devastating US imperialists' war, the enemy failed to cause us any serious trouble. Today, the enemy certainly cannot do us any harm. This is our firm belief, stemming from concrete, practical evidence. However, we must carry on the task of defending our democratic Cambodia, protecting our worker-peasant administration, and preserving the fruits of our Cambodian revolution by resolutely suppressing all categories of enemies, preventing them from committing aggression, interference, or subversion against us. We must wipe out the enemy in our capacity as masters of the situation, following the lines of domestic policy, foreign policy, and military policy of our revolutionary organisation. Everything must be done neatly and thoroughly. We must not become absent-minded, careless, or forgetful because of past victories. On the contrary, we must further steel ourselves, remain alert, constantly maintain the spirit of revolutionary vigilance, and continue to suppress all stripes of enemy at all times." It's a rather long quote, but there is a discussion here of suppressing all categories of enemies, including those committing interference or subversion. Does that relate to the policy that we've been looking at in terms of the regime's treatment of its perceived enemies?
In that kind of speech, I think you have to see it as a coded warning to Vietnam. We know what you're doing. We know you're trying to subvert our regime. We are vigilant. We are aware. It's also obviously a call to vigilance within the country, but I would have seen that as primarily waving a red flag to the Vietnamese.
I'm going to move on now to considering another aspect of your book and more broadly of the issues that we're interested in. And I want to start by, and this really relates to the functioning of the regime and of its upper echelons, to the extent that you're able to assist us. Judge Cartwright took you to two documents that emanate from the Standing Committee, one being a minute of the Standing Committee and another actually being a decision of the Central Committee. If I can just take you to these documents and see whether you're able to assist us with some of the matters being discussed. Mr. President, if I can first give the expert document E3/182. This is a minute of the Standing Committee of the 9th of October 1975.
Yes, you may do so. Court officer, could you deliver the document from the prosecutor for the expert's examination?
Here we see an agenda which includes a delegation of work and operational processes. One office in particular that I wish to discuss with you is what is described here as under number 8 on the first page that you have, and it's the beginning of the document, where Comrade Dawn is assigned as the chairman of political office of 870. You have touched upon the role of Dawn. If I have noted your evidence correctly yesterday, I think you said that this was the role he performed was an important one, that it was an executive function. But I'll let you expound on that first for us.
The political office of 870, in other countries it would be called the General Office of the Central Committee, is the office which gives implementation to the decisions reached by the Standing Committee. It's the transmission belt, and as such obviously plays an absolutely crucial role.
So then if we look at the second page, or rather the fourth page in your English copy, this is at Khmer ERN 000191111, French 002928872, and English 001833996. There's a discussion here about delegation of work and avoiding having all work concentrated at the Standing Committee level. And then I wish to look at this following this particular passage. The Office of the Standing Committee makes contact back and forth with each section. The Standing Committee monitors each section's implementation of the line. The Office has the task of monitoring implementation. Is that consistent with your understanding and the description you just gave us?
Yes.
I'll just note for the record, given that I think this might suffice for present purposes, in the 30th of March decision there is a establishment of a regime of weekly reporting to Office 870. In the part of the book that we looked at dealing with purges, you deal with the arrest of Dawn, who was a member of the Central Committee according to the book, as well as of his wife. Khieu Samphan has said on the record before this court that this office had as its members Dawn and himself. Do you know whether a replacement was appointed for Dawn or any other position within that office after his demise?
Whether a formal replacement was appointed is not certain. There is no documentary evidence that I have seen that Mr. Khieu Samphan was named as Dawn's replacement, and he has repeatedly, both to me and in his 2007 book, denied that he was the head of the General Office. But having a formal appointment and being a part of the General Office, being the acting head. These are different things. Certainly, after Dern's replacement, Dern's removal, no one else, the name of no one else has ever been cited as having been in charge of the General Office. So I think it is reasonable to assume, and it ties in with what I was saying earlier about Khieu Samphan being sent on special missions to the provinces, that Khieu Samphan certainly had an important role in the General Office after Dern left.
Thank you. Looking at the records of attendance at standing committee meetings, and you've already told us that from the minutes you've looked at, the majority of them indicate that that Khieu Samphan was present. And I don't want to invite you to speculate here, so if you think we're entering a realm of speculation, then please refrain from answering my question. But does that apparent role in Office 870 provide a rational basis for an understanding, at least in part, of his presence at the standing committee?
It's a question of what was cause and effect. Pol Pot trusted him, found him a useful transmission belt, executor, amanuensis. Was it because of that he was in the General Office of 870 and he attended standing committee meetings? Or did he attend standing committee meetings because he was in the General Office? I think the two go hand in hand, and it's difficult to say which was the cause of the other.
Thank you very much. Dealing with the actual physical location of the leaders in Phnom Penh and the functioning of offices, etc., to the extent that you've been able to obtain information on this. And you have already told us about one office in particular, K1. Have you been able to ascertain in your interviews with Khieu Samphan or others how many members of the leadership or upper echelon, however one might describe that group, were present and residing together with Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, etc.?
I think 5 were together at the bank buildings, 5 or 6. Among them, Ying Seri, Nguyen Chia, Pol Pot, Khieu Samphan, Vaughan Vet. Those I'm fairly sure of.
Most of the others you've mentioned, again, taking your book as a starting point for this, are described by you as members of the Standing Committee. Khieu Samphan, at least during the Democratic Kampuchea period, is a member of the Central Committee from 1976 onwards, again, taking both your book and his own statements into account. Were there any other members of the Central Committee that resided with and worked with the people you just mentioned, apart from Khieu Samphan?
Resided with, I'm not aware of. Worked with Yun Yat, the wife of Son Sen. I'm trying to think at Central Committee level. Well, obviously Dern when he was in Phnom Penh. Frankly, no other names come immediately to mind. It was a pretty small group. And you must remember, half the standing committee members were provincial leaders, so they were not in Phnom Penh, and the same obviously applied to the Central Committee.
In the document we looked at a few minutes ago, this October 75 minutes, under the allocation of work and operational processes, Comrade Hem is assigned, among other things, responsibility for commerce, for accounting and pricing. There are on the court's file numerous reports from 1976 to late 1978 from the Ministry of Commerce to Khieu Samphan. Is this documentation something you've had access to, and have you looked into his responsibilities in this regard?
I was aware of the documentation. I didn't do particular research on it because it was not, honestly, my topic, which was Pol Pot. But Thien Mum, to whom I spoke at length, recalled working with Khieu Samphan on accounting and the pricing of products for the Ministry of Commerce. So I have no doubt about his responsibilities.
Can I take you back just for a brief moment to the functions of Office 870, functions that one would perform within that office, apart from the missions you described into the countryside? Have you collected information or received information on any other ways in which the office implemented the orders or decisions of the centre and monitored its implementation?
There was a messenger office attached which took confidential messages to provincial leaders. Essentially, my understanding, which is by no means complete, is that it dealt with the flow backwards and forwards of information. And its importance was that it was the channel through which all this passed and therefore controlled the passage of information.
Thank you. When you were questioned by the bench, I believe on Monday, you gave the example of a seminar, education session that Khieu Samphan presided over, or where he taught, and then we looked at a specific passage. In that context, if I recall your words correctly, you said that one of his responsibilities was propaganda, and that it wasn't just in relation to elections, which is one of the areas he reported on at the Standing Committee, but that it was broader than that. Are you able to expand on that at all? What were the ways in which he carried out those responsibilities?
Propaganda itself came under Yun Yat, Son Sen's wife. Now, what we're talking about are study sessions, and all the leaders at different levels had a responsibility for study sessions. Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia at the Central Committee work conference level. Ying Sari in the Foreign Ministry would hold study sessions twice a year. Khieu Samphan, study sessions at the Olympic Stadium, in other places for the students who came back from overseas. They all did it, and he certainly had an important role, and I think it was something which he felt at ease doing, because he did it quite a lot. we're coming up to time. There is just one point before you finish. The last thing, I want to come back to the documents Southwest, Northwest we discussed yesterday.
Thank you. Would you like to do that now?
I will very briefly. I have not got a complete text of the document I was using, but I have a note which is sufficient to say it's a totally different document. And I think what must have happened is that DCCAM gave the same dates, August the 20th to the 24th, to a visit which he paid to the Southwest, and they did indeed have a standing committee meeting in Kampong Som, and the document you gave me, which describes a visit to the Northwest. If you wish the reference, it is L01022 in the what was described as the Khmer Rouge communications file at DCCAM. That is the document which describes the visit to the Southwest. So,
that's very useful, and I should apologise for not having addressed this. It was my plan to do so earlier, but we're dealing with so many matters of interest, and time is short. When you interviewed Khieu Samphan, you said on Monday that both he and Ying Siri were happy, if I'm using the correct word, to discuss the pre-75 period, but reticent, I think is the word you used, to discuss with you the Democratic Kampuchea period. If I've got that correct, did you ask them at all as to why they were apparently unwilling or reticent to discuss this period?
No, I didn't. Mr. Khieu Samphan did say we probably, after the last interview, we probably shouldn't continue any further because, you know, it's a very delicate, difficult situation for me and so on. So at that point, the interviews came to an end.
I must apologise to you because my questions now are a little bit disjointed, and it's because I'm trying to cover a few areas in limited time. So if I can take you for a brief moment to the pre-75 period, and if I can first ask you about the appointments in 1971, or election in 1971 to the Central Committee. You did describe that in that period, in your view, Khieu Samphan, a relationship started to develop, a relationship of trust, if I'm correct, between Pol Pot and Khieu Samphan, and he was elected as an alternate member of the Central Committee and also moved closer to Pol Pot. Were you able to consider whether that appointment to the Central Committee was reflective of this general relationship of trust, if I am describing it correctly?
Yes, it certainly did reflect that. Yes, it did.
Khieu Samphan has said in his statements to this court that between 1970 and 1975, he stayed permanently with the leadership. In your interviews with him, did you ask him about his activities during that period, apart from those that are publicly known? through reports and media coverage.
I can't probably be much use to you, no. I learned about Mr. Kyusampon's activities to the extent that I did, probably more from other sources than from him. Again, we were getting to the point where it was not an area he went into in any great detail.
As we move forward in time, your book describes in great detail the movements of the advanced headquarters, with Pol Pot moving closer to the city, and Judge Cartwright asked you about events in this period, and we covered some of them yesterday. One of your sources for the events in this period was an individual called Pipun, to whom you referred a number of times. He testified in this court, or described a further meeting which took place at Office B5 in early April 1975, which is an office that you describe in your book. I don't believe this particular meeting is discussed in the book. It's said to have taken place in early April 1975 and to have been attended by Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, Kyusampan, and a number of military leaders. And the topic of the meeting was the evacuation of Phnom Penh, where the three leaders that I've just mentioned, all, according to Pipun, agreed with the decision, and a discussion followed. Is this an event that you're at all familiar with? Is it something you covered with Pipun or other people?
No, I missed that. He didn't mention it to me, and no one else did, but it's entirely credible. I think you say all three leaders agreed. Yes, the decision would have been taken by Nuon Chea and Pol Pot, and essentially Pol Pot.
But this is not an event that you particularly researched?
No, I have not.
Just looking briefly at the speeches that Kyusampan gave during the period, and they do deal with a variety of matters of life and policy of the regime, etc. Were these speeches important? Were they significant in terms of a conveying, if you like, of government messages to those that were listening?
Yes, this was Kyusampan's role as the public face of the FUNC, and above all of the communist core within the FUNC, and he was there to reassure by his presence and to convey certain messages, like the message we discussed earlier about only the 7 were going to be executed.
Thank you very much. At this point, we're going to do, with the President's permission, a brief multimedia presentation. In 2005, in March 2005, you gave a lecture at the University of California, Los Angeles, and that lecture a video of that lecture is available online. And of course, in preparation for the hearing, we looked at it. We have placed it on the case file with the permission of the Chamber. The document number is E260/1/1.1R. Mr. President, with your permission, I would like to play a brief extract or excerpt from that video. And for the AV unit, this is segment number 11B. 11B. So, Mr. President, with your permission, we will play that brief segment. It's approximately 2 minutes long.
President, yes, you may do so. AV unit, could you display the video clip as provided by the prosecution?
There may be a difficulty with the segment.
So I really think that's barking up the wrong tree, because it was, I mean, we must remember, it was not just Pol Pot who did these things. I don't think so. I really think that's barking up the wrong tree, because it was, I mean, we must remember, it was not just Pol Pot who did these things. There was a swathe of leaders, really fairly substantial numbers, who thought very much as Pol Pot did. And below them, very large numbers of intellectuals, often among the brightest of Cambodian intellectuals, bought into this vision that Pol Pot held out and accepted, they don't admit it now, but in fact accepted the brutality and the violence that went with it. Because, they would have argued, the only people who we have to make this revolution are the poorest peasants, and poor peasants are brutal and violent. You can't expect them to behave like refined, educated gentlemen and gentlewomen. They're not. Life is pretty brutish in very deprived villages. That would be the argument. And then below them, you have literally hundreds of thousands of village militiamen, of district chiefs, village chiefs, police, others, soldiers, who also took part in this regime. It is not a question at all of one man imposing some devilish, demoniac vision on an entire country and holding it prisoner. Pol Pot was able to touch chords in Cambodia, which enabled him to get this revolution going. And I really don't believe that he was a pathological case any more than the others who did it with him were.
I must apologise for the poor quality of the picture in that video. It's what happens these days when things are downloaded from the internet. But we did get the sound. It is a very interesting lecture, and it's an interesting segment, this in particular. And you say here that we must remember it was not just Pol Pot who did these things. There were a swathe of leaders, really fairly substantial numbers, who thought very much as Pol Pot did. Would you include in that category of leaders Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan?
Yes, I would. They and many, many others who believed that this was the only possible way in which Cambodia could be transformed.
Thank you. And we're coming up to my final couple of questions. As you may be aware, in the course of this trial, we've heard evidence from Professor Chandler, who also opined on some of the areas that you've given evidence on. I do note that you have relied on his books in your work. There's approximately 170 references in the notes that you've sent us. So in the interest of having a complete understanding of your assessment of the functioning of the regime, I want to put to you a couple of extracts of the evidence he gave and see whether they strike a chord with you. He was asked a number of questions, obviously, about the functioning of the regime on the 18th and the 19th of July last year. And he opined in relation to the decision of the 30th of March 1976 that it was a decision that emanated from a collective leadership, not from Pol Pot alone. And he also opined in relation to the 4-year plan that was a document issued or generated collectively by a group of people, not by one person. He said it was a composite or collective effort. And I want to read to you now one particular passage and see if I can have your observations. I read to Professor Chandler an extract from his book, Tragedy of Cambodian History. And in that book, he essentially said at one point that by 1977, the regime amounted to rule by Brother Number 1 and Brother Number 2, who had become synonymous with the organization. So that was the extract from the book. Now, I asked him about that extract, given that he had opined that there was a collective leadership during his testimony. This is at document E1/93.1, so that's a court transcript, and the relevant passage is at Khmer ERN 00825 518-19, English 00827-349-351, and French 00827-505. So now commenting on that passage in the book, whereby he described Pol Pot and Nuon Chea as the sole leaders, he says, and he said the following, quote, "That's a passage that after 22 years I might revise slightly. I've come to the belief that I read a lot more material since I wrote that passage, that the leadership of Democratic Kampuchea was more collective than I thought. Although, as it comes true in the documents we've seen, the decisions handed down by Pol Pot were the final ones. He was, in fact, the executive leader of the country. And this is certainly true. And this is certainly the way many Cambodians viewed that period. They call it the Pol Pot era. But I do want to say that if I were to redo the passage or revisit it, I would say that the leadership was, from all the evidence I've seen since then, more truly collective than the evidence I had to use in 1990. Mr. Short, do you substantively agree with that opinion, or do you materially disagree with him?
I don't know what new evidence he's discovered, and that might modify my opinion as well. But on the basis of everyone I interviewed and all the documents I've seen, my impression is that there was an appearance of collective decision-making, which Pol Pot, one might almost say, manipulated to get his own decisions accepted by everybody. But fundamentally, the decisions which were made were those of Pol Pot and, to an extent, Nguyen Chia. And that extent we don't know. But they were the couple who drove the machine.
Thank you very much for your patience and your expert opinions. Your Honours, thank you for the time allocated to us. We have no further questions.
President, thank you. The time is now appropriate for a short break. We will take a 20-minute break and return at 5 to 11. Court officer, could you assist the expert during the break and have him return to the courtroom at 5 to 11? The court is now adjourned.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រុមឈរ